Stories like, "Cops need 2 tasers to bring her down," "Police wake up the most vile woman on the side of the road," "Woman thinks she's the victim after running over officer," and "Cop's patience runs out when she does this," introduce a series of intense and unexpected situations where individuals confront the law and the consequences of their actions. These narratives depict confrontations not only between police and citizens, but also between individuals and their own personal limits. From stubbornness to complacency, from defiance to violence, each character in these situations inadvertently pulls themselves into a whirlwind of self-inflicted troubles, highlighting hidden psychological struggles, lack of self-control, and a disregard for the law. These tense moments not only create dramatic scenes, but also prompt readers to reflect on personal responsibility, self-respect, and the delicate boundary between right and wrong. 1. Cops need 2 tasers to bring her down. On September 8, 2023, police received an emergency call from the manager of the Comfort Inn, a hotel located in a small, peaceful American town. According to the manager, an elderly woman named Mrs. Margaret was walking around the second floor in a swimsuit, causing a disturbance and bothering those around her. Despite receiving multiple warnings, she refused to leave the area. Her unusual behavior worried the hotel staff, who ultimately decided to call the police for assistance. When the police arrived on the scene, Mrs. Margaret showed no signs of cooperation. She appeared very tense, with anxious eyes and extremely agitated gestures. As soon as she saw the officers, she began shouting, claiming she was a free citizen and that the police had no right to intervene. Her angry outbursts, such as, "I'm not leaving, you have no right to take me," and "I'll sue you for abuse of power," echoed through the hallway, attracting attention and causing unease among both staff and hotel guests. In response to the situation, the officers tried to remain calm, gently explaining to Mrs. Margaret that they were only there to ask her to leave the hotel at the manager's request. They emphasized that this would not infringe on her personal freedom if she cooperated. However, Mrs. Margaret continued to barricade herself in her room, loudly demanding to speak to a lawyer and asserting that she had high connections with officials, including the mayor. "You don't know who I am," she shouted from inside the room, showing no intention of complying with the police. After repeated requests without success, the officers' patience began to wear thin. One officer warned that if Mrs. Margaret didn't open the door immediately, they would have to resort to stronger measures to ensure public order. Hearing this, Mrs. Margaret became even more agitated, yelling that the police were violating her privacy and threatening that they would pay the price. She stubbornly refused to open the door and kept complaining that she was being treated unfairly. Finally, realizing that there was no other option, the police had to use force. One of the officers deployed a taser, but the first shot wasn't enough to subdue Mrs. Margaret as she continued to struggle and resist intensely. This forced the police to use a second taser to reduce her resistance. Only after being tased twice did Mrs. Margaret finally give in. The officers quickly approached, restrained her, and escorted her out of the hotel in a state of exhaustion and lingering panic. The incident sparked considerable discussion among witnesses. Some were surprised to see the police needing 2 tasers just to subdue an elderly woman. A guest commented, "Did they really need 2 tasers to control an old lady like that?" While another joked, "Looks like the police need more training if they're getting trouble from a granny like this." In a tense situation, with no other options, the police were forced to use a taser to gain control. However, the first shot did not yield the expected results. Mrs. Margaret, in a highly agitated state, resisted fiercely and refused to back down. It wasn't until the second taser was deployed that the officers managed to control the situation. Mrs. Margaret was finally subdued, her limbs restrained, and she was escorted out of the room in a state of panic. Walking down the hallway, she continued shouting, repeating phrases like, "I have very close ties to the mayor," and You will regret this." Her loud voice echoed through the corridor, creating a tense atmosphere and drawing curious looks from bystanders. Witnessing the entire incident from start to finish, those present at the hotel expressed mixed reactions. Some were upset with the police's handling of the situation, believing that such force was unnecessary for an elderly woman. One guest remarked, "Did they really need 2 tasers to control an old lady like that?" While others found the scene somewhat ironic, joking, "Looks like the officers need more physical training if they're getting trouble from a granny." Mrs. Margaret's case not only sparked a lively discussion, but also raised important questions about police training and skills in dealing with individuals showing signs of mental instability. Many believed that using force in this case was unreasonable and could lead to unnecessary harm for the person being restrained. The incident highlighted the need for reforms in police training, focusing not only on physical strength, but also on handling situations involving mental health. In a complex society, police often face unpredictable situations that require calmness and effective communication skills to avoid escalating tensions. Without empathy and skillful handling, individuals under stress may become more resistant, complicating matters for both sides. Rather than relying solely on weapons or forceful measures, experts suggest that police should be equipped with knowledge of psychology and compassionate skills, allowing them to manage situations safely and more effectively. This incident serves as a reminder of the importance of modern and comprehensive police training. It's not just about enhancing physical fitness or upgrading equipment, but also about developing thinking and psychological skills, so law enforcement can meet the growing challenges of society and, most importantly, protect and uphold human dignity in all situations. 2. Police wake up the most vile woman on the side of the road. On a foggy night, under the dim yellow streetlight by the roadside, 2 patrolling police officers happened to spot a car blatantly parked in a no-parking zone. In the driver's seat was a woman with disheveled hair, her eyes half closed, and a pile of open beer cans scattered beneath the seat. The officers approached cautiously, one of them instinctively placing a hand on his belt, ready to use his handcuffs if necessary. His gaze was fixed on the woman. She suddenly woke up, staring at the officer like a wild animal roused from sleep, puffing out her cheeks, breathing heavily, baring her jagged teeth, and sticking out her tongue like a cornered tiger. "Please show me your identification immediately," the officer ordered firmly, his tone leaving no room for delay. The woman scoffed, her laughter scraping like metal against stone. "Identification? Who do you think you are, disturbing my sleep like this?" Her eyes gleamed with defiance, her slurred words drawn out as if she had no intention of stopping. "We require you to leave immediately," the officer emphasized, his gaze steady and sharp. A whiff of alcohol lingered in the air, unmistakable. "Ha, leave me alone. I haven't done anything wrong, and you think you can lay a hand on me? Just a bunch of troublemakers," she yelled, leaning back in her seat, her face etched with anger. One officer bent down, picking up one of the open beer cans. He furrowed his brow slightly. "You've been drinking and are parked illegally," he stated. "I'm not driving. Stop making things up. What do you want? Just looking for trouble, aren't you?" she sneered, her tone laced with open contempt. "Please get out of the car immediately," the officer insisted. The woman lifted her chin, her sneering smile becoming even more provocative. She crossed her arms, sinking into her seat as if daring them to pull her out. At this point, the officers had no other choice. They reached into the car, attempting to grab her wrist, but she immediately lashed out like a storm, kicking the car door and shouting loudly like a lion trapped in a cage. Her screams, mingling with the engine sounds, created an atmosphere of tension and chaos. "Let go of me! What are you trying to do, you jerks?" She fought back fiercely, her actions filled with fury and desperation. She even attempted to bite one of the officers, feeling cornered, Her punches and kicks conveyed not only anger, but also a sign of despair as she resisted cooperation at all costs. Her screams gradually attracted the attention of passers-by who watched with a mix of curiosity and fear, their faces reflecting their unease. Each insult rang out clearly, laced with profanities and venom, like relentless bullets fired from her mouth. After numerous failed attempts to calm her down, the officers had no choice but to use handcuffs, a measure they had tried to avoid to keep the situation from escalating. They held her tightly as she struggled, her screams echoing down the deserted street, creating an almost surreal scene of chaos. They dragged her out of the car, pulling her along amid her frantic resistance, like they were wrestling a wild beast. She continued to shout, hurling insults, even targeting the officers' families with her harshest words. Her curses, her slurs, filled the air, not only directed at the officers, but adding to the already stifling atmosphere. Onlookers began to gather, phones coming out to record, as if witnessing a dramatic show, yet everyone understood this was far from a joke. As she was escorted to the station, she kept spewing obscenities, her shrill voice cutting through the stillness of the night. Her shouts made the streetlights seem all the more glaring, highlighting the image of a woman who had completely lost control. Her slurs like bullets shot out mercilessly, insults ranging from sarcastic jabs to vulgarities that no one could ignore. Every passerby's gaze was fixed on her, a mix of curiosity and disgust, as if they were witnessing a tragic street play. The officers had to use all their strength to keep her standing, but her resistance was like a storm, sending chills through everyone around. Her curses and shouts created not just noise, but a palpable sense of fury, adding a layer of suffocating tension. Even while being escorted, she showed no fear. Her bloodshot eyes were filled with rage and an unyielding spirit. Only after being locked in a cell did her curses gradually fade, replaced by a hollow, defeated stare. She slumped to the cold, tiled floor, exhausted and alone, as if all her energy had drained away. In the end, the court sentenced her to 10 days in jail, a year of probation, and mandatory community service. The sentence served not only as a reminder to her, but also as an expensive lesson on recklessness, a lack of awareness, and disregard for the law. It was like a warning bell echoing in the quiet of the night, making her realize that her impulsive actions had led to an irreversible outcome. In that moment, with her past words of defiance echoing in her mind, she understood that she would not only face the law's judgment, but also a judgment from her own conscience. After enduring the cold silence of the cell for days, she came to realize that arrogance and pride cannot replace reason and respect for the law. Every shock from the sentence, every unfamiliar gaze in the police station reminded her that no one stands above the law and every action bears responsibility. The lesson she learned from this experience was not only about her own arrogance, but also about staying calm in challenging moments. Sometimes, life puts us in situations where, if we fail to control ourselves, we might fall into traps of our own making. Everyone can make mistakes, but the important thing is recognizing and learning from them. Freedom is not a right, but a responsibility, and every action has consequences. She lost her freedom for a time, but she also found the strength to face herself, and understood the value of respecting herself and those around her. Life is a journey filled with challenges, and what matters most is our ability to pause, reflect, and choose the right path, not only to protect ourselves, but to contribute to a better society. 3. Woman thinks she's the victim after running over officer. December 12, 2023. It was an ordinary day like any other in Bell, Florida, until Sarah, a powerful woman in her car, decided to turn a routine traffic stop into a lecture on freedom. When the police activated their lights and sirens, she probably thought she was receiving a warm greeting from a fan, so she slowly came to a stop, not out of respect for the authority of the police, but because she was busy contemplating how to impress others with her speed. When the officer, with a serious yet calm demeanor, spoke up, "Ma'am, I noticed you were speeding in a school zone. I need you to drive at a safer speed here." He likely hoped to receive an apology or at least a slight nod of contrition from this woman. But no, Sarah was not the type to easily admit her mistakes, and it was clear she wasn't there to take advice from anyone, especially not from those she deemed unqualified. She glared at the officer, her sharp eyes seeming to say, "Who do you think you are to remind me?" In that defiant glance was a fierce confidence, the kind possessed by a woman who believed she had mastered all the twists and turns of her life. With a sneer, she responded in an arrogant tone, "I know my speed and I always drive safely. You can't do anything to me." This declaration rang out on the street like a power proclamation, as if Sarah had just donned the crown of the queen of the streets, boldly claiming sovereignty over every inch of pavement she traversed. If this statement left the officer stunned, it was likely because he had never encountered anyone so brazen, especially a traffic violator. To Sarah, stopping in front of a police officer was merely a break in her unyielding journey. She didn't care about the police or the rules. Everything was just a game she was in complete control of. The officer looked at Sarah with a mix of surprise and frustration, as if he were facing a strange phenomenon that science couldn't explain. He wondered internally, am I talking to a real person or a mythical character who believes herself invulnerable? Faced with such an unbelievably arrogant woman, all legal explanation seemed meaningless. Thus began the confrontation between the hero, the police officer upholding the law, and the bully, Sarah, who disregarded all regulations. Sarah sat in her car with a haughty gaze, her hand casually resting on the steering wheel, exuding the demeanor of a queen on her throne. She cast another glance at the officer, as if assessing whether he was worth her time to listen to. When the officer asked her to exit the vehicle for a check, Sarah suddenly revved the engine as if preparing to enter a Formula One race. The officer could only step back like a character in an action film, shouting, "Stop! You are obstructing a lawful duty." Sarah seemed not to hear him, or perhaps she was too engrossed in plotting the next chapter of her own freedom and power movie. As two officers, Captain Johnson and Sergeant Wilson, decided it was time to take action, Captain Johnson loudly commanded, "Stop! You are obstructing a lawful duty, and we will have to arrest you." But Sarah continued driving, determined to escape the scene like a heroine from a fairy tale. In a moment of bravery, Sergeant Wilson stepped in front of the car with his hand raised, but unfortunately she accelerated, nearly hitting him. Perhaps she thought she was playing some kind of video game. The struggle reached its climax, resembling a Broadway show combining action and comedy. Captain Johnson, with a tense and determined face, dashed toward Sarah's car, flinging the door open with the seriousness of a superhero arriving to save the world from danger. But wait, Sarah was clearly not the type to be easily subdued. Sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel as if it were her last line of defense against the approaching enemy, she yelled dramatically, her voice booming as if she were on a brightly lit stage, "Let me go! You can't arrest me!" This confident and defiant statement resonated, making anyone who witnessed it feel as if they were watching a dramatic performance on the street. Yet no one could tell if it was a tragedy or a comedy. Sergeant Wilson, seeing Sarah thrashing about, might have thought to himself, "I wonder if anyone is filming this. It's sure to be a viral clip." With his patience, he attempted to coordinate with Captain Johnson, both trying to subdue Sarah, while she continued to thrash and cried out for divine protection. She prayed with a dramatic tone, as if it were opening night for a grand play. "God, please protect me. Don't let me get arrested." The scene was almost comical, as if a few light effects could transform the area into a genuine theater stage. Ultimately, after Sarah's relentless efforts, the two officers decided not to let the drama drag on any longer. They handcuffed her, completing the tense yet somewhat ridiculous arrest. Sarah was escorted to the police car, still holding her head high, mumbling something about justice and faith, as if she believed that, in just a few moments, God would appear and rescue her, bringing her back to the world she thought belonged to her. It was an indescribable sight, both pitiful and unexpectedly humorous, like everything was just a dream, a skit in everyday life where Sarah was undoubtedly the irreplaceable star. Even when taken to the station, Sarah seemed to remain in her role as if she were entering a costume party where everyone had to marvel at her action antics. In her frenzy, she kept shouting, "God will protect me! You can't do anything to me!" A powerful declaration, as if she were immersed in a film where she was the resilient heroine, defying the odds. It was as if Sarah was certain that if she just persisted in acting deeply a little longer, the script would suddenly change. Perhaps the police would realize she was innocent, apologize, hand her a bouquet of flowers, and let her go. Every time the police tried to persuade her to cooperate, Sarah displayed her tough demeanor, turning every statement into a sharp proclamation and a lecture on justice and faith, as if she were a method actor oblivious to the laughter around her. Then, after much struggle, the dramatic confrontation ended with Sarah quietly sitting in the police car, her gaze still flashing a blend of defiance and arrogance, a form of justice only she understood. Bystanders looked on with smirks, shaking their heads as if to say, "Sometimes reality is the best comedy." In this tense battle, pitting the unyielding leading lady against the persistent police, one could not deny that it was a memorable performance, where everything from Sarah's reactions to the officers' attitudes contributed to an unforgettable comedic tale. Finally, the dramatic spectacle between Sarah and the police came to a close. Although Sarah was confident she was showcasing an unyielding display of female empowerment, she ended in defeat, facing the consequences of her actions. This laughable tear-jerker left the witnesses reflecting, and we can draw some valuable lessons. First and foremost, behaving appropriately and respecting the law is essential, even if we sometimes disagree. An arrogant and uncooperative attitude not only worsens situations, but also alienates potential allies. Secondly, overacting in every situation does not make us the powerful lead character. It may only render us ridiculous in the eyes of others. Lastly, remaining calm, cooperating, and being willing to listen can help us avoid unnecessary consequences, while stubbornness and arrogance can lead to bitter endings, just like Sarah's story. Although life is not always easy, a little humility and a spirit of learning will help us navigate challenges more smoothly and prevent us from becoming unwitting protagonists in the humorous tales of real life. 4. Cop's patience runs out. When she does this. The police reversed the car, brushed their mustache, and stared at the woman in the driver's seat. She returned the gaze with an unpleasant look, baring her teeth like a wild animal backed into a corner. "Ma'am, please show your identification," the officer said in a cold, humorless tone. The woman puffed up her cheeks, breathing heavily like an angry bull. "Damn it, you people again! Can't you leave me alone?" The officer frowned, unmoved by her rudeness. "Ma'am, please present your ID, or we will have to take you to the station." "I don't have anything. What do you want from me?" she shouted, unleashing a flood of profanities. The officer observed her closely and noticed a strong smell of alcohol emanating from her. He looked down to see an open beer can under the driver's seat. "You've been drinking and intend to drive, haven't you?" "I'm not driving. I'm just parked here," she yelled, her face turning red. "Sorry, but we'll need you to take a breathalyzer test," the officer replied, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I refuse," the woman yelled loudly, thrashing around like a fish out of water. After repeated warnings, the police finally had to use force to pull her out of the car. A brief struggle ensued, but she continued to stubbornly refuse cooperation. The ordeal ended with her being taken to the police station, where she received a sentence of 10 days in jail, 1 year of probation, and was required to complete community service. The woman constantly screamed, insulted the police, and refused to comply with every request. She puffed up her cheeks, her face flushed red, and continued cursing. "I won't comply. You have no right to arrest me," she shouted, struggling fiercely as the officers tried to pull her from the car. 2 officers had to use their strength to restrain her. They gripped her arms tightly, trying to lift each leg out of the vehicle, but she kicked, scratched, and even bit at their hands. "Get off me, damn it! Don't touch me!" she screamed, her curses pouring out like a torrential storm. Finally, after several attempts to persuade her, the officers had no choice but to use force to pull her from the car. They handcuffed her and immediately took her to the station. There she continued yelling, cursing, and resisting. Profanities shot from her mouth like poisonous arrows. Despite causing significant trouble, this woman was ultimately sentenced to 10 days in jail, 1 year of probation, and required to perform community service. Her aggressive behavior and obstruction of duty led to a costly lesson in the consequences of her defiance and lack of respect for the law.